Now we're almost there. So this is the exact road that we drove when he showed me the site. It was built in 1906. It was carved in the...
Das ist ein Weg, historische Zeitzeuge sind da.
Ja, genau. And this road was damaged when the plane crashed into it. Right, left on the left-hand side, and it went over the road in the hillside. You can see exactly where the dents are. It's a little bit further away now.
The crew of November Papa 711 can be considered a microcosm of Bomber Command crews. In this crew, in civilian life, there was a bank teller, an accountant, 2 farmers, a business school graduate, and a labourer. Donald Sanderson, the skipper, was an unemployed taxi driver. These were ordinary men doing quite extraordinary things. The crewmen of the Halifax bomber, November Papa 711, were together for just 11 operations over a period of 75 days. It's just a tiny fraction of the time Allied infantry units normally spent together, which was measured in months, if not years. Many air crews in Bomber Command spent only 1 operation together, their first and only operation, due to the staggering almost 50% casualty rate. The tragedy of this crew's deaths on February 21st, 1945 was, of course, of lives unfulfilled. But to add insult, the world moved on after the war. For a time, this crew seemed forgotten, as their remains did not find a final resting place for 4 years. And the wreckage of November Papa 711 was left relatively untouched for 73 years.
I must regretfully inform you that since your son, Flight Sergeant Nels Peter Hyland Anderson, was reported missing, no further information regarding him has been received. Flying Officer William James Gilmore has been officially reported as missing since the 21st of February, 1945. For official purposes, therefore, he is presumed to have died on or since the above-mentioned date. It is a privilege to have the opportunity of sending you the operational wings and certificate in recognition of the gallant services rendered by your son, Flight Lieutenant D.M. Sanderson. Before you receive this letter, you will have had a telegram informing you that your son, Sergeant James Wilson, has been reported missing as a result of air operations. It is with regret that I refer to the loss of your son, Pilot Officer Donald Edison Sherman, but the Graves Registration Service has advised that your son and the members of his crew have been moved to the permanent British military cemetery. I have learned with deep regret that your son, Flying Officer Reginald Bertram Smith, is now, for the official purposes, presumed to have died on active service overseas on February 21st, 1945. It is with regret that I refer to the loss of your son, Pilot Officer William Wallace Wagner. Leistadt is nestled at the foot of a mountain rising about 1,000 meters above the village on the edge of the Palatinate forest on the German wine route. It's wine country, with vineyards and wineries stretching from the village to beyond Bad Dürkheim, about 4.5 kilometers away. It's as if the village is untouched by time, changing little since the war and with many families remaining here for generations. Leistadt is relatively isolated, located about 100 kilometers southwest of Frankfurt. Its rural nature did not allow the village to avoid the horrors of war. Leistadt was bombed in May 1942, and the marshalling yards at Bad Dürkheim and nearby residential areas were bombed on March 18, 1945, leaving more than 300 people dead. Villagers could be an unforgiving lot. While residents in urban areas usually afforded dead enemy airmen military funeral honors, or at least a civilian ceremony, often against orders from the Nazi government, villagers in remote areas often buried Allied dead without such honors. The residents of Leistadt did not conduct such ceremonies for the dead airmen of November Papa 711. More than likely, they saw bomber air crews as agents of chaos. Today, however, the descendants of wartime villagers embrace the remembrance of Allied forces for bringing down the criminal regime. On a cold gray morning, on December 7, 1944, Flight Lieutenant Donald Sanderson walked to the briefing room at Litna Ost to pick the crew that he would fly with on all operations. The briefing room was packed with fresh air gunners, wireless operators, navigators, bombers, and flight engineers. Sanderson's job was to select his crew. He entered the room and began to interview as many men as possible. It was kind of like speed dating. Spend 3 to 5 minutes with each man to get a real feel of their strengths and weaknesses. Did they like to fly? Were they eager to see action? Did they know their job? Were they team players? It was not particularly efficient, but since all candidates were thoroughly trained professionals, it came down to who would help make a cohesive team. Choosing air gunners and a wireless operator is pretty straightforward. It came down to whether Sanderson liked the men or not. He soon chose Wagner as his wireless operator, Gilmore the bomber, Anderson the mid-upper gunner, and Sherman the tail gunner. More importantly was choosing a navigator and a flight engineer. The flight engineer, James Wilson, would come later. So Sanderson was intent on finding the right navigator, which came down to the candidate's attention to detail. He found that man in Bert Smith, who scored high marks in training for his diligence and thoroughness. Smith was a short, dour man. Along with Gilmore, he was among the oldest in the crew at 33 years old. His instructors in Canada and Scotland praised his navigational skills, but considered him to have a negative personality. That didn't bother Sanderson. He was impressed with this serious, no-nonsense man and scooped him up immediately. Sanderson's team was now complete, Wilson coming later as the flight engineer, Gilmore sitting in the nose as the bomber, Wagner tucked below in the warmest spot on the aircraft as the wireless operator, Smith behind Gilmore on the navigator's bench, Anderson up top as a turret gunner, and Sherman way in the back in the tail as a gunner. Poor weather in January 1945 affected flying operations at the Littenows Air Force Base. With so much downtime, Donald Sanderson's crew often hitched a ride into York to patronize the local pubs. Their favorite drinking establishments in York were Betty's Bar in City Center, the Black Swan on the outskirts of town, and the Golden Ball, which is further out in the suburbs. On January 2, 1945, Sanderson and his crew began operations with a bombing raid over Ludwigshafen, port on the west bank of the Rhine River. But they were not flying November Papa 711. Flight Lieutenant Keith Edwin Parkhurst, who had been flying November Papa 711 since August, turned the aircraft over to Flight Lieutenant R.H. Fleming in January, although Parkhurst had a couple more turns with it. Sanderson was assigned November Papa 776, nicknamed the R. Roger. It was a Halifax that Sanderson instantly fell in love with. It was sturdy, reliable, and flew gracefully. When an engine quit in a January operation over Holland, the R. Roger still flew as graceful as ever. When the R. Roger was grounded for a cracked windscreen, Sanderson was assigned a clapped out, as he put it, Halifax Mark III that struggled to maintain altitude. His experiences with the Mark III convinced him that he was more comfortable and his crew would be more comfortable with November Papa 776, the R. Roger.
We're now stood in the front of the nose of the Halifax, and the crew stations are significantly different to those of the Lancasters. We have the pilot sat to one side, offset, beneath the wireless operator, and then in the forward nose of the aircraft you've got the navigator with a double bench, and of interest, directly below the double bench is the forward escape hatch, and then in front of the hatch is the bomb aimer's seat, which can either be made into a seat or laid flat for a bench. And then directly behind the pilot, we have the flight engineer. One of the good things about the Mark 14 stabilised bomb sight and its computer was that it had a levelling device in. This meant that unlike the early Halifaxes that had to fly straight and level for at least 30 seconds before dropping their bombs, the aircraft could manoeuvre, could even drop the bombs in a slight climb or shallow descent, or having just roll the wings level. Having dropped the bombs though, they had to fly straight and level then for 30 seconds. One of the busiest positions in the aircraft was the navigator, and it was probably the navigator that never stopped from takeoff to landing. He would be trying to take a fix nearly every 6 minutes if possible. That could be relying on Wayne Gilmore to visually map read a fix as they cross the coast of Holland or a big estuary or river. If he couldn't get that fix, he would have to use the G or the H2S radar and continually taking a fix every 6 minutes. The more fixes he got, the more easy it was to predict the actual wind and therefore improve his navigational accuracy. I'm actually sat in the seat occupied by Bill Wagner in the aircraft, the wireless operator. To the left of his seat, he's actually got the controls for the identification friend or foe equipment that would be used by our own radars to identify our own friendly aircraft when recovering to base. Next to him, he's got equipment that is used for the direction finding loop, a call light. Each station has a call light, such that if the intercom fails, they can actually still pass messages by Morse code to each other. Interestingly, the wireless operator, the pilot, and the navigator have actually got a panel with detonation switches on, and these would be used if the aircraft was crashing in enemy territory to destroy the secret equipment. So there was actually explosive devices inside the identification friend and foe, IFF box, the H2S radar, and the G, and any of the secret equipment that might be carried. I'm stood at the rear of two upper escape hatches, which would be used in case the aircraft ditched. The crew safety equipment would be stowed just beneath here, and they would vacate through this ladder onto the port wing and then to the dinghy that's stowed in the wing. Behind this escape hatch, you can see the guns from the upper turret where Niels Anderson would occupy his station. I'm stood at the rear of the Halifax now in the station of Donald Sherman, the rear turret. Having entered the aircraft through the side door, Donald would climb into the turret and then close these doors behind him. He'd then be cut off for the rest of the crew for the full duration of the flight. Only intercom as a means of contact. Of note is that this stowage box here is where Donald's parachute would have been kept. So if he did make an attempt to abandon the aircraft, he would have to rotate the turret fore and aft as it is now, open the doors again, with the doors open, reach in, take his parachute, clip it onto his harness, rotate the turret through 90 degrees, and then fall out backwards. Now for an air gunner, in the first couple of years of the war, the life expectancy was 6 weeks, because the main threat was forward firing night fighters, which would sneak up behind and aim to take the rear gunner out before trying to destroy the aircraft.
In their first week working together as a crew in early January 1945, the R. Roger was on an operation over Germany when tail gunner Don Sherman spotted an ME-109 hot on their trail. Imagine Sherman's jaw dropping and his stomach falling to his feet. He quickly recovered. He shouted to Sanderson, "Corkscrew port maneuver, skipper." Sanderson immediately descended and turned to his left and then quickly reversed. He climbed to the right and continued the maneuver until Sherman shouted, "All clear." The maneuver was common among bomber crews and proved to the R. Roger crew that their kite was sturdy and even nimble for a bomber, giving them the confidence they needed. The city of Worms. In early 1945, the population was about 58,000. Halifax November Papa 711 took off from Litna-Us at about 5:40 p.m. with 333 other heavy bombers, including a total of 288 Halifaxes, 3 Lancasters, and 25 Mosquitoes. These aircraft flew over Worms, battling enemy night fighters near the target, and anti-aircraft guns on the ground after crossing the German border. Despite heavy resistance, the raid caused massive damage. 39% of the town was destroyed as 1,116 tons of high explosives were dropped, killing 239 people on the ground and leaving 35,000 residents homeless. Damage was severe, with almost every building partially destroyed, including cooling towers, gas holders, oil storage tanks, ammonia plant compressors, gas washing towers, the railway station, and oven houses. The coking plant nearby was also hit. 11 Bomber Command aircraft were lost. 33 crew members were killed, 16 captured. Unexpectedly for the Worms operation, on that fateful night of February 21st, Flight Lieutenant Fleming was assigned Halifax RG 477, and his November Papa 711 was given to Sanderson. It was Sanderson's first and last time flying November Papa 711. We'll never know whether Sanderson's unfamiliarity with November Papa 711 played a role in the fatal hillside crash. Certainly, Sanderson was a talented pilot, and if he could fly an AG Mark III with problems reaching altitude, then he could handle Fleming's regularly assigned Halifax. The losses from the Worms operation are typical. Consider these horrific numbers suffered by the Bomber Command. At the peak of the war in 1944, there were 18,239 casualties, more than 2,000 more casualties than in 1943. Overall, the Bomber Command suffered nearly 57,000 casualties during the war. Consider that for every 100 crewmen in the Bomber Command, 51 were killed during operations. One flak soldier was Werner Rugenheimer, who was conscripted as a young teenager into the military to man a flak gun. The experience was both thrilling and harrowing, if not tinged with regret.
In der Flakstellung weiterhin noch Schule dabei gehabt.
I became a flak soldier because our whole school was drafted. In the flak position, we continued to have school lessons next to our flak duties, provided that was possible. But there were many reports of enemy aircraft, and we had to man the guns and equipment, and our school teacher had to leave, and eventually classes got rare. But when all was quiet again, nobody came anymore. Eventually, our teacher did not come into the position anymore at all. There were very often aircraft reported. Then we had to man the guns and the other gear. I believe there were only partial hits of the enemy by several flak crews. Because there were so many flak positions in this area, it was impossible to determine who made a direct hit and who shot just past. And it could not be proven who had made the final hit and who didn't know. The aircraft was shot down. When I was wounded, an aircraft we had hit first flew over our flak position, already burning, and the aircraft flown away first. It suddenly turned, and we were told it had aimed for and crashed intentionally into the area of our aircraft radar, which we could see afterwards. There was an enormous crater where the aircraft and all of the bombs had exploded. The only thing left was one of the propellers, and everything else was merely scrap metal. When all the bombs exploded, there were 4 Luftwaffe supporters or flak helpers, including me, and I am not totally sure anymore, but probably 8 Luftwaffe soldiers involved, and 4 of them were killed. We were young then and excited. We are good, and the others were the evil ones. I only learned later what all really happened behind our backs, and then I ran away. I know it could also have been over soon and we could die. They told us that to die for the fatherland was the best thing that could happen to us.
I'm sitting at Bill Wagner's wireless operator station. In late January 1945, Wagner took a 9-day leave from the UK to New York City to see his brother. Richard Wagner was a captain in the US Army, attached to artillery, and he fought in the Pacific. And he's also part of the occupational forces in Tokyo following the war. All 7 members of the R. Roger had taken leave at that time. Usually they take leaves together, but on this instance, being 9 days, they all went home to see their families. Bill decided to see his brother, Richard. They spent 9 days together in New York City. It was during that visit that Bill Wagner confessed to his brother that he had called into the infirmary, said he was ill. He faked his illness. He was convinced that he was never coming back. He was so rattled that he needed a night off. He took a big risk.
As their operational tours progressed, many of the young men who flew with Bomber Command began to experience a slow unravelling of their nerves, coupled with a constant ache of fear and moments of pure terror, which progressed exponentially with each raid. For some too, there was a growing horror at the impact of their operations on the ground in Germany. Psychological damage was suffered by so many of the young men of Bomber Command to varying degrees. A great number really struggled with crippling anxiety during their tours, and many had to live with the trauma for the rest of their lives. Such was the strain that some men simply went mad in the midst of battle. Flying Officer Bob Lloyd, another Canadian pilot serving with Bill Wagner's squadron at RAF Linton-on-Ouse, recalled how his navigator completely lost his mind on a trip to Berlin in November 1943. His mid-upper gunner got hit in the ankle with a cannon shell on the same trip, and he never flew again. The crew's bomb aimer went absolutely wild over the target area on a later raid. It was so bad that they had to remove his intercom and the navigator had to drop the bombs. Then Bob Lloyd himself got injured. The terrified bomb aimer had to fly out the rest of his tour with another crew. He was killed on his very next operation. The threat of being labelled LMF was almost as fearful as flying operations against the enemy, and the policy was used to intimidate and stigmatise airmen who showed indications of combat stress. And no allowances were made whether you were a 19-year-old rear gunner or wireless operator a few weeks into your training who was simply a nervous flyer, or an experienced battle-weary pilot who'd flown 25 operations and who was showing signs of extreme combat stress. Even those crews who returned early from raids with mechanical faults, particularly those that could not be replicated by ground crews on return to base, or who'd dropped their bombs too early on the periphery of the target area before heading for home, fell under suspicion. But the brutal truth was that for many Bomber Command crews, death came before many of them had any opportunity to manifest any psychological problems. Those that survived were simply instructed to man up and get on with the task. Now, Bill Wagner would have been under pressure to keep a stiff upper lip,
a veneer of steely courage and unflappability, and be seen to be doing so at all costs, when in reality he was utterly terrified. The fact that he'd already feigned illness to avoid going on one operation perhaps gives us an insight into the mind of this young man, who was already crippled by fear. How did his skipper, Donald Sanderson, respond? Did he know? Did the other crew members know? Did they experience the same feelings? Or did Bill try to keep his true feelings hidden from the rest of the crew, like so many other young airmen were forced to do?
There is no evidence to suggest that any member of the November Papa 711 crew was accused or suspected of lacking moral fibre. The crew's service records show nothing but exemplary service.
It's not well known how dangerous those missions were. NP711 was actually part of 408 Squadron at the time. 408 Squadron was disbanded in 1945. By the time they were disbanded, they actually flew over 4,600 sorties. They lost over 158 aircraft. 408 Squadron actually delivered more tonnage than any other squadrons, and they also suffered more casualties than any other Canadian squadron during the war. Out of the over 9,000 casualties that the Royal Canadian Air Force suffered, 938 were actually from 408 squadrons.
Flight Lieutenant Donald Sanderson was flying east towards Worms to drop a load of bombs on a railway station. He never made it. Rather, anti-aircraft gunfire from the ground had disabled the aircraft, and it caught fire immediately. What Sanderson did was that he turned around and was heading back to Leistadt in England, or at least reach to the sea so he can ditch the plane and have his crew parachute out. However, he lost altitude rapidly, and about 2 miles east of here, of Leistadt, Donald Sherman, the tail gunner, had bailed out. But the plane was already flying too low, and Sherman was killed.
If Sanderson had thought that the aircraft was doomed, shall we say, that the flames were so great that it was burning through the wing or approaching the bomb bay and the bombs likely to explode, he would close the throttles and look as far as possible for a clearing to land the aircraft in, a crashed landing.
The speculation among villagers here is that Sanderson was surprised by the mountain. He could not see the mountain. Perhaps that's true, but what I think had happened was that Sanderson was quickly losing altitude and he could not clear the mountaintop. And he crashed about halfway down from this position here.
Da haben wir Zahnräder gefunden, geschmolzene Aluminiumteile. Ein Zahnrad haben wir gefunden, so groß. Und dann so Teile. Ich habe erst gemeint, es wäre bei Bettflasche. So hat es ausgesehen.
Yeah.
Und das war also exakt da drin.
Exactly in this spot here, they found in his youth. He found in his youth a lot of aluminium parts and parts of the aircraft.
Wir haben dann nicht mehr gesucht, weil wir haben also so Angst gehabt wegen Explosion.
Yeah, they were a little bit afraid about explosion maybe, and they also found ammunition, things like that. Yeah, exploded ammunition and parts of incendiaries.
Ja, die habe ich mir einen jungen Mann gegeben. Und der hat sie dann heim und seine Mutter gesagt, was willst du mit dem Kram? Und hat es weggeschmissen. Ich war extra noch mal dort.
He gave it to his son, and then over the years, these pieces were thrown away, or I don't know exactly what they So this is the place where my car was standing, and he showed me this dent over there. And I went into this dent and I found first plane parts. And then I saw this open space here on this side. And I knew this must be the place, because the rocks are free now here, because over there and over there everything is pretty dense, yeah, the woods. And over here nothing grew for a lot of years. So one day I was here, we worked here, we found a lot of metal. Later came here, I saw that a wild boar had made a lot of mess and everything, and then I saw a piece of an oxygen mask. Then I dug everything out, and then I saw, in the end we found 4 oxygen masks, also big parts of it. Almost, to this road over there, almost as far as this road, parts were laying everywhere. These are parts of incendiaries. This is the weight. This one had an explosive charge in it. These are the parts that we found mass, thousands of them. Normally, they look like this. This one is one without explosives in it. It just burned, yeah. Later in the war, the Allied forces made an explosive charge in it. So when they tried to put it out, it exploded. Could explode. This one was found at the crash site and exploded in the fire here. And a lot of incendiaries were found, yeah. No parts of other big bombs or things like that, but a lot of incendiaries. And there's so much that they must have had a big part of them still aboard. The whole place here was littered with ammunition, and here you can see that this place burned, because here you see a 303 without a primer. So this cartridge was laying in the fire and exploded. And the weakest point here in the back just made the primer flying out. And when you find a lot of pieces like this without primer, you can see this place burned. This cartridge just exploded in the fire.
Behind me you see the communities of Leistadt and of Bad Dürkheim. And here, several dozen, if not hundreds of residents had seen the crash and had watched the fire burn on the mountainside. 2 individuals in particular, Klaus Handewald and his cousin Eugene Handewald, took a truck about halfway up here and then the rest of the way on foot. And they found the crash site, but the fire was too intense for them to get any closer. What they did find was a huge indentation from the nose of the aircraft hitting the side of the hill. The hillside above a cut trail and below the cut trail, as well as the trail itself, were aflame, and they couldn't get any closer. They did find some remains, and they gathered those remains into a casket, and some community members of Leistadt in particular took those remains to the Leistadt cemetery.
Also, mein Name ist August Walter und mein
I am
Opa,
August Walter, and my grandfather was the mayor of Leistadt.
von Leistadt.
He was present when the remains of the aircrew were brought here
Die Leichenteile hier
and were laid to rest in this cemetery.
oder hingebracht und sind hier bestattet worden.
This is the place where the Canadians were buried after the crash. When they were exhumed, brought to Rheinberg, this place was empty for a lot of years. Now there's another grave on this exact place.
We cannot be proud of our heritage. The Nazi time is a very difficult time also for us. The next generation, the younger generation. And that is also the reason German crash sites are not honored in this way. I believe because people did not want to speak about it in the past. And today people are opening up more because of the greater distance and fewer personal links between then and now. There is more interest in this today. We want to find out what happened because many details were kept hidden from the public because they, the older people, just did not talk about it. In the past, we had scarce documentation about it. So for us, it is essentially important to know where these sites are so we can protect and handle them properly. I hope these sites will be sites of remembrance only and not sites for tourism. I see this in two ways. They should not be sites of pilgrimage, but sites of remembrance only, a place to go and remember what happened there, but not a tourism site. I think these memorial stones at the crash sites are exactly the right medium to handle this matter, this cause, also to pay tribute to the disappearing eyewitnesses.
Some years after the war had ended, Richard Wagner, Bill Wagner's brother, was visiting Germany, and he came to the cemetery late one afternoon to see his brother's gravesite. But he had arrived too late. It was about dusk, and it's getting darker by the minute, and the cemetery was closed. Rather than be turned away, he jumped the fence, which is to my right here, not far, maybe 50 meters, and started scanning the grave sites for his brother's marker. It didn't take him long to find it. And once he found it, he dropped to his knees and began to cry. He wept for his brother for the first time since his reported missing. And he wept for his parents, because his parents lived with the uncertainty and the stress and the anxiety and just the plain horror of not knowing what happened to their son. Bill was reported missing in February 1945. It wasn't until October 1945 that he was officially declared killed in action.
He spoke so often of the boys in the crew. We felt we knew them very well, also loved them, as they seemed to be such grand boys. Donald was very fond of your Bill, and he does look so good and wholesome in his pictures. May God grant that they are spared and that they may sometime have another happy reunion. I will continue to pray with you for the safe return of our boys. Everyone here feels that the boys have a good chance of getting back. Donald has always been a hunter and used to moving quietly so as not to be heard by his prey, and everyone here feels that he will be of the utmost help to the others. Boys who have been shot down, were missing, and now returned home have been to see us, and they all give us such hope.
The crew's personal effects were gathered by the estates branch. The mundane suddenly took on emotional significance for the families. Nels Anderson's photo album, Don Sanderson's diary, Don Sherman's hunting knife and case, Bert Smith's prayer book, Bill Wagner's copy of the New Testament. William James and Helen Margaret Gilmore, college sweethearts and married for 9 years, were inseparable while living in the Pacific Northwest. She refused the return of her husband's uniforms as too painful to possess. After the war, Helen married and had a long, fulfilling marriage. She passed away in 2008 at the age of 94.
My name is Don Sanderson. I was named after Flight Lieutenant Sanderson. I was born in 1942, and at that time, my dad's brother Robert was overseas Air Force. Donald was overseas, a cousin overseas Air Force. Robert came home safe and sound. Donald was lost. Just a really nice young man. That was the main thing I've heard about him. But I used to travel up to where his mother lived, which was like six hours away. So I used to visit my Aunt Claire maybe every 6 weeks, whatever. She would often talk about Donald, obviously. And it was always that he was just such a nice young man. Very proud of him, of course. And obviously missed him terribly. But And she always took a real shine to me because I was named after Donald. And that meant a lot to her.
Few of us can even begin to contemplate the numbing fear that these young men experienced hour upon hour, night after night, when their lives were in mortal danger, and their survival dependent largely upon factors completely beyond their own control, not least a huge amount of bloody good luck. It's beyond our understanding. The air crews lived with this fear night and day. Every morning at breakfast in the dining hall, it was fed and reinforced by the sight of the empty chairs and untouched tables of the crews who'd failed to return from the previous evening's operations. For some of them, the question was not if, but when they would meet their end. But others adopted a never say die, it'll never happen to me attitude. Fear was famously described as the 8th passenger by one Bomber Command crewman, a silent but ever-present spectre on board every aircraft.
My grandmother never really spoke about his death. I think probably the difficulty for them would be not having that body, not having that, place in the local cemetery where they could go and pay their respects. I think they found that quite hard to understand because none of them had really left the UK. You look at Germany on a map, but they couldn't take it in. They had no idea of the concept of the size of the country, and I think it would be difficult for them too, not knowing exactly what had happened, where the plane came down. They had no information like that back in the day. We've got to celebrate the life of these 7 young men, so young. I mean, Jimmy was only 21. This will be here forever now. I don't want to see it as closure, I want to see it as just part of the story.
Were these men heroes? Donald Sanderson, James Gilmore, James Wilson, Reginald Bertram Smith, Bill Wagner, Nels Anderson, Donald Sherman. Did these men consider themselves heroes? I think if you asked them in 1945, they would say no. They probably replied, "I'm just doing my job." I think their first and foremost concern was their fellow crew members. The word hero is bandied about a lot in the 21st century, and I think just about everybody is identified as a hero at some time or another in their life. The word is kind of devalued, it's diminished a little bit. But we have to reevaluate what these men thought of themselves. Sure, they were doing their job, but they are genuine heroes, and I'll tell you why. Because in this day and age, in the 21st century, we have a lot of authoritarian figures on the political landscape who are doing their best to tear at the fabric of democracy, the values that we hold. And if they're successful, democracies could be badly damaged. Does that mean that these men had died in vain? I think not. But it's very possible that they gave their lives for something that 70 years later has been damaged, and that'd be democracy. So I think of them as genuine heroes. And I think today we have to think of them as genuine heroes, not just names on a headstone, not names on the pages of a book, and not faded black and white photographs. These individuals deserve to be recognized as heroes.
I thought about the way we have gone and we came forward since World War II, with Germany being now deeply and firmly integrated in the Western Alliance, in NATO. With that in mind, I thought about what it takes to get that friendship with partners and allies and what it gives us. Look at the 7 aviators who died in the crash here. They stood together boldly and fought Nazi Germany and gave their life, gave the greatest sacrifice you can give for their countries against Nazi Germany. Today we are standing together just 77 years later as NATO, as friends, as allies and partners, and we are taking our stand against another nation that is unleashing war today as we speak in Ukraine. We're taking our stand against Russia, and that is something that is important because those young men who died back in 1945 gave their sacrifice for a good reason, for us being friends and allies, for us standing.